Our topic today is running businesses that are exposed to China. So they can be multinational companies that have branches in China. They can be small and medium-sized companies who opened a branch in China, who sell to China, source from China, or let's say provide their services in China. And what I'm going to tell you today is how business in China is not going to be the same as it was before the pandemic. Because I hear from multinational executives who are my primary clientele as a coach and consultant, all too often that what they are trying to do now and what they are working hard to achieve is restore their China businesses after the shock of the pandemic. And I think if there is one overarching message that I would like to share with you today in today's video and webinar is that there is no return. The China that we are going to do business with now is completely different from pre-pandemic China. So my name is Gabor Holch. I'm an intercultural leadership executive coach, trainer, consultant. My primary clientele is multinational companies from the West, Europe and North America, with a strong exposure to Asia. I lived in China for 20 years, and in the most recent few years, I'm splitting my time between Europe with a base in Budapest, Hungary, and China with a base in Shanghai, China. There are a couple of things that I regularly hear from multinational executives who are working on their China businesses now. And obviously they are part of larger worldwide trends. When they say return after the pandemic, one of the reasons why we think in terms of return is the whole world is preoccupied with return after the disruptions of the pandemic. So pandemic disrupted supply chains, investment chains. Of course, it sent everybody home. We worked remotely for a long time. And now we are trying to restore some kind of normalcy. Teams are getting together in offices again. Executives start traveling internationally again. International conferences start resuming. People who want to invest internationally, they start visiting locations again and so on. And when specifically it comes to China, as you probably know, some of you who are watching this might have lived in China and even might have lived in China recently. So you might know that pandemic and the disruptions of the pandemic lasted longer, and especially during the end of the pandemic era, impacted business much more dramatically than in many other places. So China went through in 2022 in yet another huge wave of COVID-related lockdowns, disruptions, when businesses couldn't operate and so on. So it's understandable that people who do business in China or with China, they are trying to get back somewhere. However, I'm going to bring you 4 major areas where we have to be careful with the so-called return, because as I will elaborate, the world is changing, China is changing, so the world's attitude to China is changing, and China's attitude to the world is changing. I will go through these changes one by one, and at the end, I am going to give you some fairly practical tips and recommendations about how leaders of businesses must adapt to these changes to make sure that they are not missing the opportunities which some of these changes will inevitably bring. So what do I mean the world is changing, and why is it that the return to business after the pandemic is not really going to be a return, but as I like saying, is going to be a replan? So first of all, the shock of the pandemic was not just a health-related shock, right? It broke the world up to camps, so to speak. The, political debates between East and West, developed economies and the so-called global South, they became much more intensive. So this will manifest itself in a lasting reduction of global mobility. A lot of people who liked traveling for business internationally, a lot of people who wanted to be expat, who wanted to live abroad for an extended period of time, now they are rethinking their careers, and either they are trying to run international businesses from home, or they are trying to run them from either closer to home or certain digital nomad hubs. So typical digital nomad hubs are Ireland, for example, and Portugal in Europe, Thailand and Singapore in Asia, a couple of other places where you have good visa policies, it's easy to immigrate, it's easy to pay your taxes, there is high-speed broadband internet, and a lot of other things, welcoming population, diversity in the population, and so on. Now, this era also brought us these kind of sound bites, these interesting jingles, such as de-risking, friend shoring, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it exactly means. But usually what it means is that if we look at the supply of goods, services, money, and even people, we try to shorten these supply lines and change the supply chains accordingly. Now, this is easier to do now than it was before the pandemic, because the pandemic also saw an unprecedented technological revolution about everything that we use for remote work, for virtual teams, for gathering data and then using it for decision making. I probably don't have to elaborate on this, but if you have questions about it, then feel free to contact me. A lot of applications, including Zoom and MS Teams, databases, AI applications, and learning systems, they saw a huge upsurge during the pandemic, not only in terms of technological innovation and users, but also, for example, investment. That's where the big business was, while a lot of physically mobile aspects of business were locked down during the pandemic. And finally, there is an often overlooked reason in human resource management why the return after pandemic is going to be a replan rather than return, is that we are talking about quite a few years here. So depending on where you were and how intensive the disruption was in the place where you work, it was either a 2-year period, a 3-year period, or even longer. And let's face it, smart young people graduated from university, or people who only worked a couple of years before the pandemic, they developed a career and they have nowhere to go back to. People who are in their 40s or even 50s, they remember exactly how we did business before the pandemic. But younger people, they developed their work habits during the pandemic years, where physical mobility was lower, but digital mobility was absolutely amazing. And when they go back to, let's say, face-to-face work, even if they split virtual and physical work in an office, they are going to expect physical workplaces to have the same kind of digital agility as they had while they were working remotely from home. So this is how the world is changing. And of course, there are lots and lots of changes, but these are the ones I wanted to highlight. Now, China is changing, and in the article whose link I share with you in the notes in Asia Power Watch, which is called Why Business in China Will Never Be the Same Again. Now, one of the reasons why I'm sharing this article in the notes is that I think I wrote it in 2022, but it aged spectacularly well. So I reread the article for the sake of this video, and I told myself I could basically replace the future tense with past tense, and it would be about the last 2 years. So China was changing, or China is changing, because of all the pandemic shocks, just like any other country. Anything from factories to restaurants closed down, people were locked down, were working from home, and so on. But in the meantime, China's political priorities were changing as well, because the pandemic, the lack of income, the lack of clientele, for example, people who were running restaurants and shops and so on, they disproportionately affected people with lower incomes in China. The middle class, upper middle class, and the financial and innovation elite, they were not suffering so much because they had larger homes, often with terraces, gardens, and so on. They didn't mind being locked up so much. Also, China is still a society where money and connections can take you a very long way. So richer people found it easier to travel, to buy food, and everything else. And this called the Chinese government's attention to the inequalities in society And as the pandemic was ending, they started putting a huge emphasis on equalizing these inequalities in society. And this is why the Chinese government clamped down on technology companies that make disproportionately high profits. That's why they started limiting the private education of kids who come from rich families and so on. But this also means that people who are resuming their business in China right now, they are not going back to the previous market environment. Actually, some of the fastest growing sectors of the Chinese economy have been replanned completely. Electric mobility, electric cars, of course, technology is a very huge part of it. The investment scenario is completely different. Education and real estate, which were the two areas with the highest investment from private citizens in China, both of them are replanned in completely different ways. And finally, China is changing because I mentioned to you how important technology is in the post-pandemic international business world. However, there is an interesting thing here. This kind of technological revolution, it happened in China just as well as anywhere else. However, during the pandemic, we saw divergence of technologies that we use globally and technologies that we use in China. So, conferencing software, payment software, artificial intelligence, databases, and so on. China has always had its own digital ecosystem. But during the pandemic, the differences, the gap between the tools that we use worldwide, let's say Microsoft Teams, certain databases, Google Clouds, and so on, and the ones that they use in China, they distance themselves from each other even more. So this is something very considerable when people resume their businesses in China after the pandemic. Two more changes to talk about: how the world's attitude to China is changing and how China's attitude to the world is changing in a few minutes. That was a very interesting quote from Jörg Wuttke in an article somewhere in the middle of the pandemic when the 2022 lockdowns in China started. He said, the world is not going to wait for China. The world is not going to wait for China. What does this mean? At that time, most countries were already resuming from the pandemic. China was just going into another lockdown. Today, I think, is a good illustration that indeed the world moved on and China has become a little bit like a shopping mall that was closed for 2 years, and now they are opening, and then let's say they are allowing customers to come back to China. But it doesn't just take opening the doors and allowing people to come back. People have already developed other habits. They took opportunities elsewhere. One of the things that changed during these years is how China sees the world. And many people expressed it, that the reason for that is international media. And to some extent, I agree about this. But we have to look behind the admittedly biased media coverage about changes in China right now. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that international media can be so biased and so negative about China? And I think one of the reasons is that China, during the pandemic and right after the pandemic, made an enormous public relations mistake when basically they picked a fight with international journalists, not renewing their licenses to work as journalists in China, not renewing their visas. And basically now the world is full of very influential people who are writing for renowned publications who basically are on a personal vendetta with China. And all they are doing is writing negative stories about China. And these are the people who established a reputation before the pandemic for the ones knowing China very well and having inside information. Obviously, now that they are everywhere else, because they cannot be journalists in China either, now they don't have as much direct daily information about China. And the combination of these two factors means that the image of China as an investment destination, as a destination for expats, and as a desirable business destination suffered almost regardless of what actually happens in China. Now, the other one is that the world moved on in another sense. Everybody knows, who is following news on China, is that international companies and experts are leaving China in large numbers. Why is that? International experts and companies kept coming to China for 2 decades for fast economic growth, for a huge market in a relatively early stage of development, and huge need of international know-how. And that opportunity is not in China anymore. So if we want to look at the anatomy of why foreigners are leaving, they are mainly leaving exactly for the same reasons why they arrived 20 or 15 or 10 years ago, except the same kind of dynamism that large companies can use to make a lot of money out of huge turnover. These kind of opportunities like cheap labor, infrastructure development in an early stage when they need international investment, and a large market which is relatively unsaturated and untapped. That is right now in India, in Indonesia, which are new markets, and a couple of countries that have been in the center of international business, and now they are developing even further, like Mexico. And finally, obviously, the technological revolution simply helped foreigners to run businesses in China from outside of China. So what we can see is a lot of people who ran businesses in China and left during the pandemic. Now they are not in such a huge hurry to return for 2 reasons. Number 1, it's easier to work remotely. And number 2, people don't move as quickly as capital or trade. So if somebody moved to another country a year ago, they're not going to just pack up again and return to China. So that's why a lot of executives who actually run China businesses, now they are in the Middle East, now they are in Singapore or some other digital nomad hubs. Actually, a lot of the people that I call in my book dragon suits, who are experienced China-based executives, a surprising amount of them are in Portugal right now. It's becoming one of those big digital nomad hubs that I mentioned before. The last thing is China's attitude to the world is changing. One of the psychological reasons for that is that there is an awful lot of resentment in China for being blamed for the pandemic. And if this is justified or not justified, I really leave it up to you. But it is a fact that in international media, this is a topic and that China really resents it. And this started making China drift away from some of its major trading partners, like Australia. For example, you probably know the background story about Australia calling for an independent investigation into the pandemic and how it created political tension. But also during the pandemic, China's relationship with Japan, South Korea, United States, and lots of others who were major business partners for China deteriorated. Also, as I mentioned to you, the Chinese government's priorities changed with more equitable distribution of income that hurt major businesses which were targeted by multinational companies such as technology, education, retail, real estate. There are some sectors which are doing extremely well, like renewable energy. Professional services are doing quite well. Some other areas where people who don't want to spend on flats now, they can spend on, let's say, luxury cosmetics. Those companies are doing well. But overall, China is right now not in the mood to put an awful lot of effort into creating opportunities for multinational companies like they did for about 2 decades, I would say, since the so-called beginning of the reform and opening period. China is now trying to reverse this trend and trying to extend privileges to international business people, such as visa-free entry to several European and Asian countries. Now it is possible from very, very recently to establish an incorporated company in China online. So these things are going to make a little bit of difference, but in my opinion, they will not balance out the damage that was done to Chinese international reputation in the eyes of investors and expats, and also the new opportunities that are coming up everywhere else in the world. So what do leaders of international businesses with an exposure to China have to keep in mind out of all of this? And then we are going to see how this relates to your own business. First of all, returning to business is not a return in the sense of rebuilding previous business. It has to be a replan, because China is going to be completely different after the pandemic. Now, when I say China is changing, the world is changing, I would underline is changing, because very often companies are replanning their China strategies now, or they are choosing people to run their China businesses, and they make long-term plans based on the current situation. I could mention things like the China for China strategy, where multinational companies say, well, okay, maybe the mobility between China and the rest of the world is not so intensive as before, but we can build entities which are manufacturing in China, developing intellectual property in China for the Chinese market. Or management localization, when they pass formerly expat jobs on to Chinese people. But the situation will keep changing, and decision makers will see the limitations of these strategies, because multinational companies, they cannot function and they cannot compete with increasingly smart Chinese competitors if they don't stay open to the world. This is the competitive advantage of a multinational company in China, as opposed to the local company, that the multinational company has access to international investment, cash, ideas, people, know-how, opportunities. So managers must make sure that they have the technology and the people to connect China with the rest of the world. You would be surprised in terms of technology, for example, how much manual transfer in large companies goes on between the Chinese digital ecosystem and the international digital ecosystem. Multinational companies and even small businesses who work with China, they must find a way, manual or technological, to bridge the digital ecosystem between China and the rest of the world, because they are the ones who are in the position to do so. Chinese businesses don't really understand the applications that people use all over the world outside of China. You can see how stuck Chinese people are when they live abroad or they go abroad, and you cannot use digital payment systems in another country. And also in terms of people. Now, the European Union Chamber of Commerce says that about a quarter of multinational companies in China now operate without a single foreign employee. No foreign managers, no foreign technicians, and so on. At the beginning, this was celebrated as China for China strategy, but then they also find out that this cuts the China branch off from the rest of the operation in the world, headquarters included, because Chinese managers don't travel that easily. Very often they don't speak multiple foreign languages, and sometimes they struggle with English, if for no other reason that they are a little bit perfectionist with their language skills, so they are afraid of making mistakes. They are not really as interested in international opportunities as managers who lived in China from another part of the world. And also in terms of opportunities, know-how, and so on, Chinese managers are not so exposed to the rest of the world as international managers. Now, right now, we are still talking about Chinese managers doing formerly international jobs who have the international experience. They lived abroad, they worked with foreigners before the pandemic, they were trained in headquarters. But that generation of Chinese managers will run out very soon. And the next wave of Chinese managers are going to be the ones who haven't gone through all of this big international exposure. So I think it's very important that international managers, yes, they localize Chinese people, they understand Chinese culture better, they speak the language, but in strategic positions, they put in preferably Chinese-speaking foreigners who can bridge the operation with the rest of China. I hope that these tips and insights are useful for your own business. And now, if you are a participant of the webinar, we are going to switch into the discussion mode. If you want to hear a little bit more, follow me on LinkedIn, follow me on YouTube, or join my next free webinar. And I'm going to post a link in the notes to make sure that you can follow my events as well. If you want to go a little bit further and you want to work with me as a coach, trainer, keynote speaker, or advisor, in the notes section, I'm going to leave a link where you can schedule a free call and we can take it from there. Find me online and drop me a line.